Our next speaker is Lee Walston. He is an ecologist. I don't know why I'm having trouble saying that. An ecologist at Argonne National Laboratory with over 10 years of experience in natural resources modeling and assessment. He's been involved in a variety of integrated assessments to evaluate the impacts of energy systems on ecological resources. Recently, he's been involved in landscape scale approaches to evaluate the landscape compatibility of utility scale solar energy developments by investigating the ecological trade-offs of site management practices and compensatory mitigation strategies. So welcome, Lee.
All right, thanks Iris for that introduction. So I'm Lee Walston, I'm with Argonne. We're a federally owned and operated research lab operated for the Department of Energy about 20 miles or so west of here out in the suburbs, so pretty close. And we've been working with NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory out in Colorado on a couple of related projects that have over time have started to focus on the idea of pollinator habitat. At Argonne, we've worked for DOE on projects to address the environmental challenges and improve what we call the landscape compatibility of large-scale renewable energy projects, focusing primarily on wind and solar. And so, like I said, through one of our projects that we have with NREL that we've been supporting NREL on, we've started to look more closely at pollinators and looking at how the provision, at least, of pollinator habitat at these sites of renewable energy development might help us better understand some of the environmental benefits that could come from these developments. So let's see here. So just to kind of put things into context when we talk about large-scale solar, we're talking about projects that are typically greater than 1 megawatt in size that are ground-based for the most part, and they feed into the electricity grid. So when we talk about utility scale, that's kind of what we're talking about, not necessarily rooftop solar, but things that are ground-mounted and kind of feed into the grid. They typically have pretty large spatial footprints, depending on which technology type you're talking about and when in the history of solar it was installed. We can calculate on average it's about 8 acres per megawatt. Sometimes it's lower than that if you're talking about what is the actual area under the arrays versus what is the permitted area, that kind of thing. But for what Argonne is kind of looking at and what NREL is looking at, we're looking at somewhere between 7 and 8 acres per megawatt. So they're pretty large. When you talk about a 500 megawatt facility, you're talking about something that's on the order of 4,000 acres in size. This is a large-scale PV photovoltaic facility, the one shown here on the left, in the desert of Southern California. Like I said, it's 550 megawatts on about 4,000 acres. Not all of the large-scale solar projects, however, are like this. The majority of them are like this. They're smaller, but still they occupy that same relative footprint. This one is about 3.5 megawatts, and it sits on 30 acres of land in Massachusetts. So this is more typical of what the utility scale solar projects that we see, but a lot of the ones that have made the news for environmental reasons, they're the ones that are like in the desert Southwest that are the really massive solar projects, which do occur. Just to kind of give some more background and context on the rate of development, this graph, I just want to basically use this graph to show that there's been a lot of solar development and there's a lot of planned and foreseeable solar development going on in the future. There are over 220 existing utility scale projects with, I think, over 600 that are planned based on some of the data that we've seen. The average size, however, is on the order of about 12 megawatts. And some of the data that we've looked at, it indicates that I think more than 80% of these utility scale solar projects, more than 80%, are under 25 megawatts. So again, not the massive projects that we've seen in the news out west, but things that are a little bit more manageable on the 25 megawatt scale or less. And looking at the distribution, the geographic distribution of these projects, this is data that we've got that we received from EIA, the Energy Information Administration. You know, it's probably no surprise that we see the majority of the projects in California. But what might come as a surprise to some people is that there's a lot of solar development on the East Coast, especially in North Carolina and other states. So again, by definition of utility scale, 1 megawatt or larger, feeding into the electricity grid, there's a lot of solar happening on the East Coast and in areas that are much more productive for pollinator habitat benefits. There's an opportunity, or at least we see an opportunity for solar pollinator habitat in these areas. And so the legend here just kind of shows the projects by their nameplate capacity size. So the projects that are, you probably can't differentiate the orange and the red very well on this slide, but you know, going from the green, these are like the projects that are less than 5 megawatts. The orange and the reds, they're getting up over 5 to 25 megawatts or more. So that's what the colors represent, but the colors here don't show it very well. And so, like I said, we've been involved with NREL for projects for the Department of Energy to look at those environmental challenges and to improve the landscape compatibility of large-scale solar. One of the more recent projects we've worked on has been to focus on previously disturbed lands and to look at how solar can be co-located with other land uses to kind of maximize the use and those benefits. So looking at co-locating solar projects on agricultural lands. NREL's been doing a lot of work in looking at how vegetation performs underneath the solar arrays, doing a lot of vegetation studies within solar arrays, as well as looking at the co-location of solar and agriculture, looking at how certain crops like kale can be grown under the PV panels. But sort of extending from that is the idea of providing pollinator habitat at these solar sites of solar energy development. There's been a lot of renewed interest in restoring the ecosystem services of these sites, especially if you're looking at sites that could be 100 acres or larger because of the size of the PV facility. And so we've started to ask the question, and we've been asked the question of what are the possible benefits of solar pollinator habitat. And really what we've got this really basic schematic here to kind of show what we're thinking about when we think about solar pollinator habitat. There are the conventional options, and that, you know, there could be some sites where there's just no vegetation allowed, and there really are some solar sites where they prohibit any vegetation growth. It's just all crushed gravel pretty much within the site. There are sites that just allow, you know, basic turf grass, or something that stabilizes the soil. But what we're thinking about in terms of solar pollinator habitat is something that provides habitat for pollinators, whether it's flowering habitat for food, or sort of maybe nesting habitat in the soil to improve nesting opportunities for pollinators, whether on-site within the solar arrays if we're thinking about a PV facility, or also in mitigation, what we call set-asides. I was talking with Rob just a second ago about how there might not necessarily be ways to provide as much pollinator habitat on-site, but within a lot of these solar developments will lease areas that might not all be developed, and there might be 10% of the leased area that might not be developed with solar panels. Well, that 10% might represent a good opportunity for providing high-quality pollinator habitat. So what if solar developers, and at these sites of solar development, they started installing and maintaining pollinator habitat? That's the question we want to ask in going forward, and we're just barely, I think, trying to move the needle in that direction to understanding what those potential benefits might be. And so for our purposes right now, when we're talking about what is solar pollinator habitat, we want to consider it to be something that's sort of on the green end of the spectrum, something that's doing a little bit more than turf grass. You know, we acknowledge that it's more than turf grass. We're actually planting something that has pollinator-friendly seed mixes in the mix, but we also recognize that there could be more done. There could be more done to improve the diversity, the more to manage the soil in such a way so that it improves nesting habitat for the pollinators. That's out of the scope of what we're here. But we will acknowledge that there could be more done. But what we're saying is that there, in this space here, the provision of some sort of pollinator habitat in this space here, we want to look and see what are the opportunities or what are the intersections with potentially nearby agriculture that could benefit from that increased pollinator service benefit resulting from this type of habitat. So there's been some discussion on building that business case. We've heard some talks earlier today on building the business case and other applications, and I think Rob later will talk about more specifically the business case here for solar developments, but there are also, a number of ecosystem benefits that could be seen through solar pollinator habitat. I've listed a couple here, biodiversity benefits, stormwater and erosion control, carbon storage and sequestration. But what we're focusing on here and sort of the small lens that we've got that we've taken a look at is the agricultural benefits through pollination services, mostly because it's sort of we see as almost the lowest hanging fruit out of all of what we've listed here. We also find it sort of interesting in that agriculture that in some degree depends on pollinators have sort of paradoxically resulted in the decline of some, or at least contributed to the decline of some pollinators through the intensification of agriculture. So we thought that this was a really good starting point for at least, like I said, getting a start, taking that first step towards understanding the pollination service benefits of solar pollinator habitat. So we felt like the first step was kind of doing just an intersection of where are there intersections of utility scale solar and nearby agriculture that could benefit from solar pollinator habitat. So this is a very high level and generalized schematic of what we did. We mapped out all of the solar facilities based on that EIA data. These include the existing and the planned facilities. We buffered each one by a certain buffer width that would get us at that 8 acres per megawatt buffer. That's what's shown here in the little yellow circle. So even though solar facilities are not circular, we know that they're mostly they're squared shaped for the most part. For the purposes of this analysis throughout the entire U.S., we did this for all projects across the U.S., we figured that a circular project footprint would suffice right now. And so we buffered things by an appropriate buffer width to get us that 8 acres per megawatt relationship. And so it looks like in this example here, these 3 projects that are shown just as for example purposes are the same size. They're the same size. And then what we did was we buffered those project footprints by a 1.5 kilometer radius that, based on the literature, we felt is a suitable representative of the maximum foraging distance of a pollinator. Now, there's regional differences in that pollinators in some regions might forage at farther distances or less, not as far. But we felt that 1.5 kilometers was a suitable maximum foraging distance to buffer these sites. And what this represented was the foraging distance of that average foraging distance for the general pollinator in the United States. So that's a 1.5 kilometer buffer, that dotted line right there. And then what we did, again, across the entire U.S., is we clipped the cropland data layer from the USDA, which is a raster data set for the entire U.S. That shows what crop types are grown at a 30-meter cell. We clipped those down to those 1.5 kilometer buffers and characterize what was pollinator dependent in some degree, and summarized what could be these potential intersections between solar and pollinator. Here is a table showing some results. It looks like California obviously has the most amount of solar development and also the greatest amount of land within that, what we call the foraging distance, the foraging zone, the 1.5 kilometer foraging zone. But there's some other states that kind of jump out that indicate that there's potential, or at least a high degree of potential, intersections between solar and ag. North Carolina, Massachusetts, and New Jersey all have greater than 2,000 square kilometers within their total foraging zones. And I apologize for the table being in metric right now, but didn't have enough time to convert things to acres. But down here, I did convert this to acres. In total, all these top states with the greatest solar foraging area, these top states all have over 6 million acres of land within that foraging zone. Now, that's all great, but we don't know how much agriculture is within that foraging land. And so we clipped that agriculture land down to those foraging zones, and we saw that overall there's over 800,000 acres of land throughout the entire United States within those foraging zones that are at least somewhat dependent on agriculture, at least somewhat. They benefit in some way from insect pollination. That could be soybeans, cotton, could be almonds, could be cranberries in Massachusetts. And so a big driver of this is for a lot of states in the Midwest, that's soybeans. States out in North Carolina, that's also soybeans, but up here we get into cranberry territory, and I've got some more slides to show, but another key finding that we found was that there are at least 12 states with over 1,200 acres of some type of pollinator-dependent agriculture within 1.5 kilometers of a solar site. Now, if we were to look at cropland that's what we call to be highly dependent on agriculture, so that's cropland that by definition from the peer-reviewed literature that is at least 40% dependent on insect pollination, we see that there's nearly 90,000 acres of highly dependent pollinator-dependent agriculture within these foraging zones around solar facilities, with some key states popping out. California with the almond industry, a lot of almond orchards near solar facilities. North Carolina pops out. It has a lot of soybeans, and really North Carolina doesn't really have one crop type that's dominant, but a lot of various crop types that are nearby. New Jersey and Massachusetts has a lot of cranberry bogs near solar facilities. So we're seeing what we're kind of quantifying here is that there's a lot of potential within solar facilities. Here's a summary of some of the low and moderately dependent agricultural types near solar facilities. Again, these are the ones that are at least they have some, they benefit to some degree, but it's not that they're highly dependent on pollinators. Soybeans is one of them. There's literature that suggests that native and wild pollinators can improve the yield and the size of soybeans by 18%. So one it might not be conventional wisdom to think of soybeans as being pollinator dependent, but they at least benefit to some degree from pollinators. And so there's over 775,000 acres of just these crop types within the foraging distance of solar facilities. And when we look at the highly dependent crop types, almonds jump out in California. There's just a lot of almond orchards in California, but cranberries in Massachusetts also pop out. There's over 1,900 again, metric hectares in cranberries in Massachusetts that are within the foraging distance of the solar facilities in Massachusetts. So we're able to quantify at least those intersections, okay? And so just for a gee whiz kind of exercise and a what if exercise, we did some back of the envelope kind of calculations to see, okay, well, what if there was something done at some of these solar sites that tried to improve pollinator habitat? What could be, again, the potential service benefits to some of these nearby agricultural sites? So again, we kind of took a what-if exercise and did some rough calculations for the almond industry based on if we assumed as a service benefit that would increase the yield of almonds by 1% at these solar facilities. So there are about 73,000 acres of solar almond plantations or almond orchards that occur within the foraging area of those California solar sites, which is about 8% of the almond industry, which is a $5 billion, well, according to the production value, it's a $5 billion industry. So that's 8%. And again, this is a back of the envelope calculation, if solar pollinator habitat were to somehow help increase the yield even by 1% within that area, we could be looking at a benefit of maybe $4 million to the almond industry. We did something similar for cranberries in Massachusetts. Again, the cranberries that are within the foraging area of the Massachusetts solar energy sites is about 1/3 of the state's cranberry production, which it's about an $80 million industry based on the production values. And again, kind of doing the same kind of back of the envelope calculation, we're seeing that maybe if Massachusetts solar farms helped improve cranberry production by 1%, that could be seen as maybe a $266,000 value. I'm very sorry I went way over my time. So we've got a framework that we're looking at to really kind of take this to the next step. I'm sorry I'm not able to explain that in much more detail, but that's what we did. Thank you. Any questions? So maybe I'll ask my own question. So what are we trying to do next? So what we would like to do next is kind of take this from a very hypothetical level and go down maybe closer to a real-world application and use some site-specific data to actually do some more modeling to see what could be the ecosystem service benefits related to the pollinator services provided by solar pollinator habitat. We've got a framework that we're trying to work with NREL and some others on. So, yes.
Do you see any benefit in trying to convert old parking lots, big massive asphalt? With so much asphalt that's not being used anymore, closing walls and that sort of thing. Do you see any benefit in trying to put solar energy onto an old parking lot and maybe doing some experimental planting or experimental?
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility, and I know some states have looked into that. We haven't personally looked at how that could, the ecosystem service benefits of that, but it would, from a land use perspective, it's certainly, something that would be a priority to, previously disturbed lands, especially lands that have been paved and are no longer being used. It's something that we would want to prioritize. Yeah. Okay, thank you.